First of all, I would like to thank the AICA in Slovakia, AICA International, and the Getty Foundation. I have titled my paper "From Art Criticism to Contemporary Critical Practices in Ecuador" to discuss the sites and character of critical art writing in the contemporary art scene of my country. And this discussion is framed within this interest. I have been working on the construction, the development of the modern art institution or the modern art system in Ecuador, thinking about it as a dialogue of colonial patterns, the prevalence of colonial patterns, and the prevalence of modern institutions in a country and in a culture far away from the dominant centers. In the last 2 decades, art criticism in Ecuador has undergone significant changes. It has not only become a practice more linked to cultural and social critical theory, but the places and channels through which it is practiced have greatly modified. As elsewhere, we can now speak on an expanded field of art criticism that is practiced from many places, perspectives, actors, and that refers to many forms of art. Though the field itself has not become significantly larger, it does have become more dynamic. At this point, perhaps I should say that art criticism as a practice is actually have been a very precarious practice in Ecuador. And I will put this in the context of the development of art criticism in Latin America. In this paper, I would like to propose that art criticism in Ecuador, as in other parts of the world, can be better understood as a critical practice that functions on a dialogical and horizontal relationship to the object, the artist, and/or the public, and thus that it is no longer possible to separate clearly the spaces of action of the artist, the critic, or the curator, and that it is in its traditional judgmental form no longer works for the local art scene, which has experimented a reconfiguration in the last decades. I will be describing this scenario with the purpose of shedding light into the role of art criticism in small artistic communities, distant from the dominant cultural centers, where art criticism may have had a different function, although it may be expected to follow the dominant global model. Thus, it should also indicate some elements about the local developments in relation to global tendencies and the tensions generated by it. Before describing this scenario, I would like to put it into the context of Latin American intellectual tradition, which since the 19th century, when most countries acquired independence, has dealt with the issue of colonialism and dependency. A moment of climax of art criticism in the region was the Cold War years, when critics assumed different, often opposed positions in relation to the issue of incorporating, adequating Latin American art into international standards and supposedly universal values, as Andrea Junta has shown for the Argentine case. The debate developed around the incorporation position and the opposite one, of differentiating radically from the Western tradition, which showed an anti-colonialist position. At least the first work of Marta Traba, the Argentine-Colombian art critic, can be identified with the first one, and the defense of craft and popular culture tradition advanced by Garcia Canclini, the Argentine-Mexican critic, a cultural critic, Mirko Lauer, a Peruvian critic in the 70s, and Ticio Escobar, Paraguayan critic since the 80s. They have favored or they have advanced the defense in the 70s and 80s of popular culture as as essentially Latin American art. Until the 70s, both positions were clearly based on essentialist views of art and reflected an old debate about the tension between the construction of a local distinctive Latin American culture and its belonging to the West. By the 80s, this polarized view of culture was put into question by a new generation of critics working with instruments of postmodern and post-colonial theories. The Cuban Gerardo Mosquera introduced a critique of the geopolitical factors that determine the legitimation of peripheral art in the centers. Throughout different Latin American countries, art criticism, be it contextualizing or of a more polemicist character, has played an important role in defining the debates and disputes around the local production and its relation to the international art scene. In Ecuador, art criticism as a practice that gave art production a place in the context of the development of the country as a modern nation state began in the 19th century. Perhaps at this moment I should say that this beginning was very important. We had a very important art and literary critic. With the point I want to make today is that in spite of that, the art criticism has been very precarious, very little, it has been practiced very little in the country throughout the 20th century. And this is important to make a point in the context also of this very rich tradition of art criticism in the rest of the region. The creation in 1904, let's see if of the National School of Fine Arts was an important moment in this process. So even though it has been precarious, it has existed. So the first important moment was 1904 with the creation of the National School of Fine Arts that became the catalyst of a small but dynamic art scene. Among other activities, the school published the first art magazine in the country. In 1918, a group of artists created the magazine Caricatura, whose focus on this medium indicate its critical intentions. The artists working in this magazine and in the next one, in Revista Hélice, that appeared in 1926, where artists that had been formed in the National School of Fine Arts. So they moved from working with caricatures as a political criticism to avant-garde in Revista Hélice. These art magazines, as well as newspapers and literary journals, were the sites where art criticism was practiced at the beginning of the past century. The critics were mostly journalists, but also artists and writers who defined and promoted the modern art that was being produced by themselves. The 30s and 40s, as in other parts of the world, were developed radical art movements, politically art movements, that also generated independent initiatives that counteracted the official culture. Independent artists and writers created parallel salons, galleries, and publications. This autonomous art scene was, however, captured by what at the moment seemed like a very good initiative of the government to create the Casa de la Cultura Ecuatoriana, the House of Ecuadorian Culture, which was founded in 1944. The House of Ecuadorian Culture we have the old building of 1944 on the left and the new building of the end of the 50s on the right. Capture all these initiatives, and for at least 20 years, it was the most important cultural institution in Ecuador. And of course, by the late 60s, it had become an official institution that limited the independent initiatives of artists and intellectuals. Though through this institution, many magazines were published, and many art and literary critics were linked to them, there was never again since the 20s published another art magazine exclusively dedicated to the visual arts. Many literary magazines, but no magazine dedicated to the visual arts until now. Since the 70s until the late 90s, art criticism in Ecuador has been more visible and dynamic. It was situated in newspapers and magazines again, and the 70s were marked by a huge expansion of oil exploitation and export trade in Ecuador. Thus, approximately between 1972 until 1982, Ecuador lived an important economic boom. This boom had important effects on the art scene. During this decade, the government created and supported the creation of national museums and institutions for the protection of the cultural heritage. A great number of galleries bloomed, and with them, an unprecedented art market. Due to these economic conditions, education expanded, and thus art education and the professionalization of artists. While during the 70s, the academic background of critics was still linked to literature or journalism, and they wrote mainly newspapers, by the late 80s and during the 90s, their academic background was more closely linked to the visual arts, particularly art history. For some observers of this period, its negative legacy was the configuration of an art scene mostly based on market values. While many galleries opened, most focused exclusively on commercial art products, like the one on the top. But some did promote experimental and alternative proposals, like these water sculptures of the 1970s. The museum acquisitions practices follow the same market tendencies. Instead of developing reflexive and curatorial politics. In this context, art criticism moved in between the promotion of new artists that could be accepted by the public and by potential buyers, and the support to new emerging art practices. It functioned divided by the will to create a public that accepted art and the need to move into more radical critical practices. In spite of the dominant commercial artistic atmosphere from the 70s to the 90s, critical artists did find the spaces to show their work and did receive public recognition as never before. This description I have just made has to be put into context of a myth that has pervaded Ecuadorian art scene, the myth that I just mentioned, that it has never been, art criticism has never been produced in Ecuador. What I want to show now is that art criticism has developed mostly off the typical institutional sites where it appears, newspapers, magazines. And for example, from the 80s on, and especially in since the 90s, perhaps art criticism took place in roundtables, radio, and not so much in the print arena. And today, it has moved once again to an alternative sites. The artistic scene reached its highest point in 1987 when the International Painting Biennale of Cuenca was created. However, by the mid-90s, a doubt had been casted over the preeminence of painting in contemporary art in the local scene, and a big debate about it had been launched. The intensity of the dispute had to do, in fact, with the dismantling of a myth that had been founded in the 19th century by the first modern art theorists of the country that imagined Ecuador as a country of painters. The dispute reached its highest point at the end of the 1990s and early 2000s and defined the character of the contemporary art field at the time. The relation of art to the market came into question, and its involvement in social and political issues was demanded. The role of art galleries and state institutions was also challenged. So was the role of art criticism. The crisis of painting of the modern art scheme in Ecuador coincided with one of the country's most dramatic political and economic crises. As in other parts of Latin America, already as early as the mid-80s and throughout the 90s, a series of governments advanced a neoliberal project and favored the shrinkage of the state apparatus. This affected, in the first place, the educational and cultural systems. In Ecuador, those museums that flourished during the 70s, by the late 80s and during the 90s, saw an increasing reduction of their capacity of action, and by the end of the 90s, most private galleries had closed. Though the economic factors were determinant in the crisis of the artistic and cultural institutions, an additional factor was the exhaustion of the value system of modern art and culture in the local art scene. In the midst of this debate, what role did art criticism play? During the late 80s and first half of the 90s, the field was signaled by the entrance of a group of professionals trained in the visual arts, who contributed with a reflexive and contextual analysis. They wrote mostly in newspapers and cultural magazines, but with the art galleries at their climax, they also contributed to exhibition catalogs. Here I am showing two images of the Cuenca International Biennale, in which we can see how inside this this event, the debate took place about the relevance or not of painting. In 2007, the projection of images on the wall of a building in the city was defended both by the artists and the critics, the judges of the event, as painting. So this was a move that ended up by the changing of the name of and the institutes of the Cuenca International Biennale to Cuenca International Biennale instead of being of Cuenca International Biennale of Painting. Okay. So here again, going back to this example, what I am showing is that art criticism debate was taking place outside the regular sites or the most traditional sites, mostly in debates, in round tables, or even in the festivals and biennales. As I was saying, in the 80s and the 90s, there were some cultural magazines or general interest magazines that had sections of art criticism. But by the 90s and early 2000s, art criticism moved again to other sites, which were blogs. Most writers started to open blogs, and here I have 3 examples. Río Revuelto, Arte Contemporáneo Ecuador, which is led by a critic who was writing during the 90s in newspapers, but then he left that job and he has his own blog, and so he works in a much more independent way, no dependency with corporate magazines or galleries. In La Selecta Cooperativa Cultural, it's a cooperative of artists and young critics. Sometimes the same person, sometimes they are artists and critics. So they also work with this in this blog. They have changed its name, and now it's called Experimentos Culturales, cultural experiments. And these have become much more dynamic sites for discussion on contemporary art. So art criticism has moved from newspapers, magazines, and even exhibition catalogs to these sites, moving away from the sites that limited the work of art critics, be it to corporative magazines like the one I'm showing here, which is Diners. You may recognize it's a credit card. So they have a magazine and they promote it, the writing of art criticism, but of course they limited very much what could one could say in those articles. So art criticism in a polemical sense could not be practiced in those spaces. Since the financial crisis and the reshaping of the art system in the 90s and early 2000s, art criticism has moved to these new sites. To begin with, the professional profile has moved also from visual arts to critical theory, and this has responded to more specialized formal education. Again, to put this in the context of the institution, of the art institution, the art scene, it's very interesting that in Ecuador, many universities are offering postgraduate studies, just a very few have MFAs, what is in the United States an MFA or Masters in Visual Arts, but rather more have postgraduate studies on cultural theory, cultural studies, visual studies. And in these masters are forming, are promoting a new site again, or a new panorama of critics with a very different perspective than before. Some of them are artists who go to these programs, and some are people who just dedicate themselves, who are art historians or come from anthropology or other backgrounds, and that are now working on the art criticism. Paradoxically, while these blogs are proliferating in Ecuador, it is in this scenario that for the first time in Ecuador, a magazine hired an art critic as part of its permanent staff. So at the same time that magazines don't seem to be the site anymore, the magazines are now hiring professional art critics and giving them a permanent position. At this very moment, this situation has ended again because our present government is putting a lot of limitations to the press, and precisely this magazine, Vanguardia, has just closed. It was a magazine that was working, functioning for about 20 years, and under the pressure of this control over the press, the magazine has closed, and so we don't have a site, a traditional site of art criticism anymore. By the 2000s, one can say that a contemporary art scene was established in Ecuador. I am going to show you a few works. I'm starting with the latest one of 2013, by an artist, Pilar Flores, who did his installation, Diary of an Iris, very beautiful and delicate and spiritual content in this work, that it looks very dark here, but it was very subtle in the light. So a contemporary art scene was established in which artists working on new media, on installations, video, were starting to find new spaces. As I was telling you, in the 90s, most art galleries closed due to the crisis. By the 2000s, new spaces were open. Again, like the blogs, there were regularly independent art spaces, not corporate, but created mostly by artists. At the same time, the government has both the local governments and state government, the national government, has taken over the creation of new institutions. So we have both situations of new government institutions supporting the arts, like a Ministry of Culture, which we didn't have before the 2000s. And at the same time, artists creating their own independent, and artists and curators creating their own independent spaces. This movement outside the official spaces has also led to a type of art that is more linked to the community. I am showing here something that is going to be very familiar to most of you, a citation of Smithson Jedi. And here we have two women artists, working with a community in the city of Guayaquil, where all these algae cover the river. And the local government hires people to clean up the river. So here the artist works with the workers and create this figure. We have here these two images in the day and the night, seeing how the workers have been incorporated into the creation of the artwork. This is one of the same artists. Here again we have a citation of the work of the Brazilian artist Hildo Meireles, Inserciones. Graciela Guerrero, this artist from Guayaquil again, picks up this idea of insertions into the society and makes a criticism to a campaign of that was developed by the Catholic community in the city to promote the unity of the family, which is what we see in the left image, a typical nuclear family that even has a dog. And the artist creates these alternative stickers that she puts on the buses. The other stickers are put on the private cars of these Catholic families. She puts them in the buses, showing these the other families that represent the very rich ethnic diversity of the country, and commenting on the social segmentation of the country and the prevalence of the social differences in the country. Art criticism in this context operates closer to the diversity of artistic productions outside the official spheres. It has become more of an accomplice of art production that works in dialogue with it instead than as a judge. In words of one of our prominent art critics, Maria Fernanda Cartagena, what is important today, as I cite, is not the promotion of contemporary art in itself, but instead to position our practices within the ample field of possibilities, being conscious of the political, ethical, and epistemological consequences of our work. We should identify the public to which we're addressing, and we should recognize the advantages of working from the margins of the global art system. Close citation. This citation is important because it puts us in the context of precisely what I was saying at the beginning, that the construction of a modern art system or even a contemporary art system in Latin America has been pushed in many, has responded to a demand of being part of the dominant art systems. And perhaps that has not always been functional to the development of a local art scene. In Ecuador, as I was saying, art criticism has never had a very large space. And perhaps what it does has responded to a need of less judgmental criticism that decides what is in vogue, what is not in vogue, and a demand to create a criticism that accompanies the works of art as is now happening today. These collectives of artists, curators, and critics seem to be more functional to the development of a contemporary art scene. This scene is functioning, is operating in an independent fashion, even to the present government efforts to capturate it through its institutions, which it has had some success anyway, because some of the artists and curators have been hired by the government. They have now good jobs, well-paid good jobs, and in a certain way they have abandoned their independent initiatives. Cartagena, in this context, Cartagena says, independent social actors still lead the processes and make up a powerful sphere of negotiation. They still have the capacity to transform, translate, imply, and modify contemporary meanings, practices, and artifacts. Up to this point, I have offered a brief panorama of the sites in which art criticism has deployed in Ecuador. At this moment, I would like to define its character. I would venture to say that perhaps the most visible form of art criticism anywhere, it is difficult to say if it's in fact the most common, though, is one that judges and qualifies. In its best form, it also contextualizes and provokes debate and discussion. In Latin America, this tradition of art criticism came to its climax in the figure of Marta Traba, the polemical Argentine-Colombian art critic I have mentioned before, who had a big influence throughout Latin America. Until recently, this style of art criticism has been considered exemplary. In Ecuador, this polemical type of criticism developed during the crisis of the art institution in the 90s. Then it was justified in the need for changes in the art scene, in the need to, the debate centered on the obsolescence, in the supposed obsolescence of the modern art values. Thus, painting, galleries, official cultural institutions, and art criticism itself were put into question, and the development of a contemporary art scene was demanded. At the center of the discussion was an old myth in societies that have gone through colonial processes, that the Ecuadorian art scene was out of touch with what was happening at the international arena. Of course, in the context of an interconnected contemporary global world, this argument was no longer relevant. The debate brought upon some positive results, such as the creation of contemporary art museums and cultural centers, but but also some negative ones, as the marginalization of artists who use traditional media in spite of the contemporaneity of or pertinence of their proposals. Today, once the contemporary art scene has become more diverse and plural, the polemical character of art criticism that marked the 90s and early 2000s has relinquished. Since the institutional and economic crisis, the advancement of collaborative and relational art has been accompanied by critical reflections that look inwards and deal with issues that have to do with the production of contemporary art as a political strategy. Interesting initiatives that combine art production and theoretical reflection have taken place in artistic residences in small urban or rural marginal communities, in which the dialogue between artists, critics, and the community promotes social change. Examples of such initiatives from the 90s on are the festival Al Zurich, of which I have brought a poster of the latest edition, which is taking place right now. And while I'm here. Today, in Ecuador, as in other Latin American contexts, artists work from the specific problems of their particular social communities, and they have become active social agents. In this context, art criticism, art writing, and any type of theoretical reflection about contemporary art is less a judgmental criticism and more part of a social or political process. Thank you.
Microphone, okay. Thank you very much for your interesting and in-depth look at the artistic art scene in Ecuador. I would like to ask you maybe your personal opinion about, you were saying that art criticism moved from its judgmental role into more cooperative, but do you think we can still call the art critics if they're not critical of what the artists are doing? I mean, for example, also in Slovakia, which is maybe even a smaller art scene than in Ecuador, because I believe you have 15 million inhabitants, we have only 5 million. So it's a very small art scene, everybody knows everybody. So it happens a lot of times that people, if they write something about art, it's not critical at all. It's just stating facts. This happened, this is like this is like that. So, which for me is okay if you want to promote some activities or write about them in newspapers for general public. But if you want to write critical essays or articles for other art critics, curators, and artists, I think you have to be a little bit more critical just to place the things happening in a context, and maybe to judge a little bit what is to say your opinion. So I just want to ask you if this less critical attitude is for you okay, and if still it expresses opinion and ideas, or it just summarizes what is happening.
Okay, yeah, well, good question to clarify a few things. Yeah. Well, I would say that in Ecuador and as elsewhere or in other parts, the debate has centered around this issue, or this has been a point of debate, whether salons and whether art criticism in that fashion is it still functional. Perhaps it is. Perhaps, like you say, this is the point of rupture. This is a way, this type of criticism, which is today being informed by a better education from the part of those that work on art theory. But what is in question is this prevalence of this, what we say, the modern art system, in which the critic, at the end, even by doing this, what I have called this judgmental criticism, what does is promotes some and perhaps obscure other artists. So I think it's interesting that although that, like you say, it's very important to do that, I think it is very interesting to see a more informed form of theoretical practice that puts, that contextualizes the work of artists, that locates them within larger debates.
Well, piggybacking on that question, would you say that having this cohesive, collaborative energy, a scene that's created by maybe the internet and the whole debate that went on about painting, going into new media, is that more of a threat to a government that you're describing as more and more prone to censorship? Is that less threatening than having, say, a really strong critical voice who then could be absorbed into the government? Sounds like that's what was a strategy that most governments have.
Everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, to silence that one critical voice, or is this kind of scene that you're describing, is that a threat to the government or more beneficial, you think?
Well, the government, what has done is capture these independent, some of these independent, the people of this collective of artists, Al-Zurich, they are now working in the ministry. So they have become, in Spanish we say gestores, managers of art, promoting programs, and there are more things happening in official spaces. Yeah, so in a certain way, you can say that the art scene is much more dynamic, but it's been managed by governmental officials. They are artists, they are theoreticians, but they are working for the government. So what I wonder is how much of course I'm being a little bit, working also with a modernist ideal, but I was wondering how independent they can be if they're working for the government. So that's the point where we are. We have been demanding, there has been a big demand for decades for this type of spaces, and for finally to have these opportunities to show work, but the government cannot help to control very much what is happening in those spaces.
Well, thank you for pointing out in this locality why
Yeah,
our
very
profession
local.
is the hardest in the world to get that tension, between being independent and wanting to be collaborative. And I mean, I thought you really fascinating, your whole historical evolution that you revealed.
Thank you very much.
Also, along with Latin America's fortunes and decline.
And perhaps to just add a little bit, it's this poster that I have brought here, Al-Zurich. It's a pun, it's a play of words, playing with the idea of the South. Here we've talked a lot during these days about the East, but we are the South of the North. And in Quito, in the capital city, the south of the city has also been marginal. So this festival has it talks from the marginality of the south of the city. El Sur, here in Zurich, as the capital or one of the capitals of the Western world or the Northern world.
Yeah, we have a question over there, please.
Yeah. I don't know if this works. Does it work? Yeah, it does. I thought it was interesting to hear from you that, where it seems to come from, the power of art or art criticism at this point are indeed the margins and not the centers. And I think this is something one should be thinking about also, whether or not the margins in themselves can become centers of, subversive energies that would otherwise be suppressed by official apparatuses and museums, institutions, etc. Is that what you're implying in your?
Yeah, When I was talking about the 80s, the magazine I showed there, I myself worked for the magazine as a freelance writer, and that I wrote the article that was being portrayed in the in the cover. And the experience, for example, for my generation in the 90s was that we cannot be too critical, talking about the criticism. The maximum that we could say is that I don't want to write about that artist because I'm going to be, I'm going to do a strong criticism, and the magazine would not publish that. So I think it's a much more, it has a more subversive quality today through these more independent spaces of blogs and.
But is it also more obscure? Does it remain sort of
yeah,
circling within itself?
Exactly. It's circling around the art scene. It probably has less. It is getting less towards a more general public.
Right.
Yeah.
That's probably the problem.
That in those general interest magazines were geared towards a general public, and that was also the idea of not doing this strong criticism in those galleries, because they supposed that the general public did not want to hear that.
Right, yeah.
Would you consider the Bienal de Cuenca an old scenario for contemporary Ecuadorian art? Because sometimes we feel quite isolated, the Ecuadorian contemporary art in the Latin American context.
The Bienal is going to open on the 1914. It's preparing right now for its new edition. And the beginnings of the Cuenca Bienal, it is not written anywhere, but I remember hearing in debates that one of the organizers, the founder of the Bienal, saying that what they wanted was not only to promote contemporary Ecuadorian art, it was to promote Cuenca, a very local Cuenca contemporary art, which, if that was what they wanted to do, it has been successful. Some of the most important Ecuadorian contemporary artists are from Cuenca, and so it is a scenario for to put in contrast contemporary Ecuadorian art with a regional or international contemporary art scenario. I don't know if I answered your question with that. Was that?
What about the isolation that sometimes we feel in the Latin American context for the Ecuadorian art?
I could not hear very well what you said.
Możemy mikrofon?
You missed my second question,
Yeah.
that I was wondering if you feel that the the Ecuadorian artist is quite isolated from the Latin American constant.
Yes. And perhaps what I described today is a reason of that isolation. Ecuador, I was even going to bring a map to show you where it is, because maybe some of you don't know it. A small country in the western part, in the Pacific coast. Marta Traba, this famous critic, this important critic, described in the 70s the western countries of South America, some of them, especially she was referring especially to Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia, as isolated, as closed, and she said the Atlantic countries were more open, but one should ask, open to what and close to what? But yes, they have remained isolated. Peru, which is a bigger, there it is, Ecuador. And Peru, right to the south, a very, in Peru is a similar debate about how Peru has this very ancient culture, and part of their identity is linked to that ancient culture of the Incas, of the Inca Empire. But for different reasons than Ecuador and some similar ones, Peru remains also very isolated. But yes, perhaps Ecuador is one of the most unknown to international art scene. Now that AICA has been mentioned, or Yulia, I pronounce it in Spanish, Cosiche. For example, in Ecuador, we had some artists working on that vein. In the 50s, we had a women artist, Araceli Gilbert, who even lived in Europe. She lived in Sweden. She was married to a Swedish explorer, scientist, and in spite of that, she showed in Paris, she showed in New York, and that her work is important, she's not well known. She's not known internationally. She's not in the books. She's not in the exhibits of Latin American art. Perhaps this has to do with this precarious, I have described the art scene in Ecuador, but it has been a precarious art scene. Maybe the art criticism or the curatorship has been not very developed to bring out artists outside of the country. Perhaps another reason is this Casa de la Cultura Ecuatoriana that I'd mentioned, founded in 1944. This institution that was supposed to promote culture, it promoted national culture, and in a certain way closed the country, or closed the cultural production inside the country. Many writers who were contemporary of the writers of the literature boom of the 60s were not promoted outside the country. The country was very much closed in itself.
Okay, thank you very much,